Senator Di Natale.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Look, like many people in this place, this is an issue I feel very, very deeply. Both my mother and father came here in boats, not under the threat of death or torture, but in the hope for a better life. Now, I do understand better than most the courage, the sacrifice and the sadness that comes with turning your back on your culture, your language, your traditions, because you've lost hope. And it's this legacy that I bring to this debate. First and foremost, let's never forget this isn't a debate about boats, it's a debate about people. People who have fled their home countries because of the fear of death, persecution. Mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters. Now, at the heart of this dilemma lies a central question. Should we punish people who seek refuge in the hope that we prevent further suffering, or should we protect them and provide them with that refuge they seek? I know there are many, many good people here in this place that believe punishment's necessary because it acts as a deterrent to others, and in doing so it might prevent further deaths. I also know there are others in this place who believe that punishment's necessary because they've never believed that refugees have a right to enter Australia by boat, and that in doing so this somehow represents a violation of our borders. We decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. That best reflects this sentiment. And I'm not going to spend any time on this argument except to say that many decades ago, in response to unimaginable cruelty, nations across the world gathered together to ensure that all people have a right to seek refuge. We're not just obliged to do it under international law. It's the moral thing to do, it's the right thing to do, it's the just thing to do. Rather than focus on that, what I want to focus on is this question of safety at sea and deterrence, because like many good people in this place, I've been greatly disturbed by the recent deaths. Now, if our primary concern is the welfare of people making this perilous trip, we're not confronted with a simple choice between stopping deaths at sea and relative safety. It's much more complex than that. It's not a simple choice for the individuals involved, and it's not a simple choice for those of us charged with deciding how to respond. The first question to answer is, does deterrence work? If the risk of death at sea isn't a sufficient deterrent, it's hard to imagine that anything that government does will make a substantial difference. Just today I've heard from NGO workers in Indonesia who tell us that asylum seekers are aware of policies in Australia, but that the threat to send people to Malaysia won't stop them. We heard from Senator Milne earlier today that there are many thousands of people in camps in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and yet, despite those many thousands, we've settled but a few. I don't think anyone would argue that refugee movements for the large part are in fact a reflection of broader international trends, and also the fact that we are a wealthy, a safe, a democratic nation makes Australia a desirable location for people who seek our protection. Now, I know that the Coalition argue that their policy stopped the boats. This despite the fact, as Senator Milne said earlier, the sinking of the Civex with over 350 people occurred several years after the introduction of TPVs and months after the introduction of the Pacific solution. Now, it is true that there are fluctuations in refugee numbers that have occurred after changes in government policy, but this is a case of correlation rather than causation. Just because something happened during your time in government doesn't mean you're responsible for it. I do, however, accept that these facts are contested. I also accept that if this was a decision that carried and no other consequences, there might even be an argument to test it. I understand that the Australian community are desperately sad of what they've seen and they're reaching out for a solution. So too am I. That's why this isn't simply an argument about deterrence and whether it works. There's much more to this debate than that. If we do accept that government action plays some role in deterring people from embarking on a dangerous boat journey, and I don't accept that that's necessarily the case, there is still a much larger question to answer. Should the government turn away people who are seeking our protection? Turning people away, even if it is for the right reasons, but turning people away who have a genuine right to asylum and sending them back to countries that have not signed on to the Refugee Convention also has terrible costs. It means committing people who have already endured untold suffering to further suffering. Now, some people will say, well, they have their lives. But many refugees will say that such a life without hope, is not a life worth living. They may not lose their lives at sea, they may not make the 6 o'clock news, but many die or suffer in silence. Some will take their own lives. Young children are damaged, and the suffering endures behind locked doors. It might not have the impact of a death at sea, but their suffering is no less important. I'll never forget the great harm inflicted on the thousands of people who legitimately sought our protection but were sent offshore to suffer away from the gaze of the Australian public. The suicides, the self-harm, the kids who scream in their sleep. That is the consequence of the bill that we're being asked to consider today. And there's also another great injustice at the heart of this bill, and that is that we would punish one group of traumatised and vulnerable people legitimately seeking refuge and protection here on our shores, as is their right, simply to send a message to an entirely different group of people. We don't accept that for Australian citizens. We never have. We should never accept it for people from other nations who seek our protection. There's been a lot of talk over the past few days about policies that work, policies that are effective, policies that have made a difference. But the real reason we're here today is because we can't agree on how we actually define success. What is a policy that works? We know that some people are going to argue that stopping the boats is all that matters, and that's the only thing that's important. But I can't ignore that offering refuge to people in need of protection, that not inflicting further suffering on an already traumatised group is just as important. I've always believed that a wealthy country like Australia, a country with so much to give, should offer that protection because it's a sign of strength, not weakness. Ultimately, though, I take my guidance from those people whose welfare we purport that we're trying to protect, from those people who are fleeing torture and persecution in their home country. Like the 14-year-old Pashtun kid who lives on the Pakistan border, who watches his father and older brothers taken out of a bus and shot at point-blank range. He leaves his home country. He flees the very real prospect of torture or death. He arrives in a transit country on our doorstep, where he faces the threat of imprisonment, where he'll never get a job or an education, and he makes a decision to come to Australia. From the perspective of a refugee like him, the decision to board a boat to come to Australia is an entirely logical one. Return to your home country or stay in a transit country and risk death or imprisonment, a life without any meaning or hope, or take that risk, knowing what it means, in the hope for a better life. For some, this is simply the lesser of two evils. Now, Mr. President, I'm here not, as a show of party unity. It's not why I'm here. I have wrestled with my conscience on this issue. I've looked for compromise. And I do understand that in politics, just as in life, compromise is important. It's essential. But I've always believed that real leadership means knowing when not to compromise. Because compromise can soon become betrayal. Betrayal of those people who, when the Civex sank and instructions were issued to prevent any refugees from reaching Australia via boat, it was the Greens that stood up for them. Betrayal of the values that I hold dear. And above all, a betrayal to those people who seek our protection. Madam Acting Deputy President, we are at a stage in this debate where we have reached at least some agreement. I do believe there is some consensus for action. It seems now that all of us in this place agree that we must increase our humanitarian intake. And I think that's progress. We do all agree that we need to work with our neighbours, both in Malaysia and Indonesia, to improve the way we process and care for asylum seekers. We agree that they need to have legal safeguards so that people are safe while they wait. In short, we all agree on the need for a regional solution. It seems we're also reaching agreement on the fact that we must adequately resource the UNHCR. There are such small numbers of people charged with the responsibility of processing the many thousands of men, women and children lingering in camps near our shores. As Senator Milne said earlier, with such limited capacity, with such great need, it's no wonder that so many people are taking risks to come to Australia. We can do something about this problem today. We can adequately resource the UNHCR so that we process more people and we do provide a safer pathway for people who have every right to seek our refuge and protection. I'd also say that in some ways this debate's been somewhat of a watershed, and I know it might be a forlorn hope, but I do believe that many of us in this place are here with the best of intentions. The suggestion that we should have a multi-party committee to try and make progress on this issue is a good one. Why not meet behind closed doors, away from the glare of the media spotlight, and do our best to depoliticise this issue? Let's not pour any more fuel onto this fire. We also need to think about uncoupling the zero-sum game that comes with pitting onshore versus offshore refugees against each other, establishing quotas that work independently of each other. And we heard from Senator Milne about the critical need to take concrete and practical steps to improve safety at sea for all peoples who seek to make this dangerous journey. I do know that not everyone will agree with our position. I know that. I've heard from some of them. I've spoken with some of them. I know some of them are angry. I know many of them understand. But it is a position taken in all good conscience, knowing that there is no single right answer to this terrible, terrible dilemma. I do say to those people that people who do criticise our position aren't just criticising us. They're criticising groups like Amnesty International, the many human rights groups who we've spoken to and sought guidance from, the UNHCR, the many thousands of NGO workers currently in camps doing the work of processing refugees and trying to provide them with a pathway to a better life. Mr. President, as I said, I do understand, or Madam Acting Deputy President, I do understand that despite our best efforts and regardless of what we do here today, some people will continue to take risks to come to Australia. I understand the courage and the sacrifice necessary to take those risks. I also understand the deep sadness associated with that decision. But it's always been my belief, it always will be my belief, that we, as a rich, prosperous, generous, compassionate nation, have an obligation to never turn people away who seek our help, who seek our protection, and seek to make their lives a little bit better. Thank you.